1939, August 1939. I'm 8 years old, the youngest of 5 children, 3 sisters, a brother, and we're all on vacation in Lebanon, on a beautiful hilltop in Lebanon, surrounded with pine trees and dozens of grape arbors. We're having a wonderful time. We're there about 2 weeks, and then on September 1st we come to dinner. My dad is seated at the head of the table, and usually he's very excited about hearing what we had done that day and what we had accomplished, what we had found, discovered, and he's very quiet. There's clouds over the table. I can still see his face. He's like a dark cloud over his head. And then towards the end of the meal, he puts his knife and fork down, and he says, "We'll be going back home to our house in Baghdad the next day." We're all surprised. We thought we'd be here for another week, at least. Then he says that war had begun in Europe, and blames it all on one man. Then he says the name Hitler. And the way he said it, I can still see his face. He said it with such venom and hatred. "Hitler," he says. And so the next morning he hires a car that drives us, with a driver, of course, drives us to a train station in Beirut. The train station is absolutely mobbed with people. There are hundreds of people. There are about 3 trains waiting to go, and there are hundreds of people on the platforms everywhere. I get separated from my family, but I did manage to get on a train. I saw my brother or my dad getting on this train, and it's one of those things. In the old days, the trains all had these carriages with a passageway down one side and then compartments along the way. Anyway, so there I am, and the train starts moving, and it's shoulder to shoulder. People are standing there, and this man looks down and he says, "Who do you belong to?" And I must have looked very confused, so he picked me up and he said, "Who does this boy belong to?" No one answered, so he passed me over his head with my khaki shorts and white shirt and sandals, and to the next person, and the next person took me and said, "Who does this boy belong to?" And I went all the way down the carriage practically. I can still feel their hands on my legs. They were very gentle and very careful. And finally we passed the compartment where my mother was seated with my sisters. And I can never forget the expression on her face. She said, "Mine!" She lowered me into her arms. She hugged me and said, "I thought you were with your father." My brother was with my dad. I just wandered off. I was a very curious child. Anyway, the next day we were back in Baghdad to our beautiful home. It was a big house with many rooms on one side. It's sort of a U shape like this, and then a huge garden over here. It had date trees, 3 date trees, orange trees, lemon trees, dozens of rose bushes, all kinds of flower beds, all of it cared for and made to bloom by a wonderful gardener, Ibrahim, an old Muslim with a beard and a turban. And I look forward to telling him all about our trip to Lebanon, because I spent many hours with him in the garden. He would tell me stories about the Garden of Eden, comparing it to our garden. One time when I was 6 years old, a bee stung me on the finger, and I began to cry, and he hugged me to him, and I buried my face in his beard, and the pain was gone. From that moment on, I would look at his beard as a magical place. But anyway, so he would tell me stories about the Garden of Eden and comparing and explain how he made things grow. And then one time I watched him climb our 3 date trees, one after the other, and place a little sprig of green in the bulging pods. It was a cross-pollination attempt from better palm trees across the river where Ibrahim lived. And if I stood on our side of the river and looked across, there was just a complete, a beautiful jungle of palm trees across the river, which I dubbed as Ibrahim's home. Sometimes I would wait for him to come to work at the end of the bridge. Other times I sat on the front doorstep of our house waiting for him to show up. And one time he showed up holding a big fish upside down, its head buried in a watering can filled with water. He ran past me with a very determined smile on his face and went quickly to the center of the house, put the fish in the fountain. First it floated belly up, and he looked kind of disappointed. Then it started moving, and it swam, and he looked at me. He was so happy he had completed this task. Then he showed me how to feed it little pieces of bread. Now that fish lived in that fountain for a couple of weeks, and I had a lot of fun feeding it bread every time I came home from school. But one day I got home and there was no fish in there. That night we had fish for dinner. And I refused to eat. Anyway, so by this time had marched on. It was 1941. The war in Europe had spread, and there was anti-Jewish feeling rising all over Iraq, especially in Baghdad. And I came home one day, and my mother took me aside very gently and told me that Ibrahim had flown to the sky. I know. She had told me the same thing about my grandfather 2 years earlier, but that didn't stop me from running out to the garden and looking up, hoping I'd see him up there and he'd wave to me. But of course, no one worked our garden for a couple of weeks, maybe longer. Then I got home from school one day and Mom told me that Ali, Ibrahim's son, was working the garden. So I ran out there hoping to talk to him about his dad. And he was digging by the back wall, just very, very forcefully. He was different, of course. He had no beard, no turban. And I remember his chest was he was very strong. And I watched him there for a while. He was working, and then he paused, and he looked at me. He put the pick down, and I said, "What are you doing?" And he looked at me for a good 15 seconds or so, and he said, "Hitler is going to come to Baghdad, put all you Jewish boys in sacks and throw you in the river." And I remember standing there thinking that name Hitler had heard it again. I told my mother what he had said, and of course he never came back to work there. But very soon after that, there was a coup within the Iraqi government, replaced the pro-British government, and put a man by the name of Rashid Ali in charge, who was a Nazi, who was a Nazi sympathizer. They declared war on Britain, and thus the 30-day war between Iraq and Britain commenced. There were air raids, bombs, air raid sirens, just a lot of the sounds of war. And I remember one morning I was waking up and I heard the sound of a plane coming very low. And I ran to the edge of the garden and there was this German plane with 2 engines with smoke pouring out of one of its engines, skimming the top of our date trees. And now I can still see the swastika and the iron cross on its side. And I think it crash landed about a mile away in a field about a mile away from our house. Then another time I was by the window of our house. I looked down the street, up and down. I was a very curious child. And then 2 Nazi officers came. Of course, I had never seen them. And I saw the swastika on their arm, which fascinated me, and their very fair skin. And I said, "Mommy, look." And she came away and dragged me away, closed the curtain. Anyway, the war continued, the air raids, and one time after an air raid I snuck up to the roof and looked across the river, and there where all the Ibrahim's all the date trees were on fire. Wow. I could hear the sound of the flames as it gobbled up the trees and fell down. And I remember thinking very sadly that Ibrahim's home is burning. Anyway, the war came to an end 2 weeks after that. There was silence. The British had driven out the small force that Hitler had sent and the pro-Nazi factions of the Iraqi army. And then there was quiet. And then rioting broke out at the far end of Baghdad, coming towards our house. It was a pogrom. They killed about 350 Jews and did horrible things. Anyway, it went on all through the night. I still remember the sounds. And the next morning, it must have been quite early, someone shouted that there were soldiers on the street on horseback. And I ran to the front window, and I will never forget this image. There was a column of soldiers with their pistols drawn, galloping towards the rioting. There was the sound of a lot of gunfire after that, and then silence. And then there was a good 3 days to a week's curfew, no one on the streets. And thanks to the machinations of my dad and my uncle, we were on a plane to India, where I was packed off to a British boarding school in the mountains for 8 years. Of course, I went home on holidays. And also, when I got there, I did not speak a word of English, and I was fluent in, I think, a month. Upon graduation, our final papers were corrected at Cambridge University in England, and then I followed my dream, which was to come to this country. I landed in New York when, after 4 years of college, I was drafted into the U.S. Navy, which was a wonderful experience. Sailed all over the Mediterranean. I was on the flagship, which was very big. And then I got out of the Navy after my 2 years and went to New York to follow my dream of becoming an actor. I lucked out. My first audition was with the Living Theatre for the play of The Connection, which became an international hit. It was an incredible experience. And then they did other plays. I was with them for about 2 years. And then I went on to do plays in other theaters all across the country, in New York, of course. And as an actor, I came out here, drawn to Los Angeles, and to my friends Susan and Paul, who introduced me to my wonderful wife, Jane, and built this great place for us to share our stories. Thank you.